In this video, we get to hear neuroscientist Dr. Andrew Huberman from the Huberman Lab walk us through his personal example of experiencing the ultimate dopamine signal when losing a letter at the beach. And before we get there, he explains how the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex can calm us down by accessing different rule sets which can be useful in reducing anxiety by reframing or reappraising stimuli in less maladaptive ways. And all this begins by having him first walk us through the autonomic nervous system.
What we can really think about the autonomic nervous system as is a continuum, or more like a seesaw, of at one end is alertness, and at the other end is calmness, right? That is translated to the so-called sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, but I'll call it the alertness and calmness system just for sake of simplicity. So it's sort of like a seesaw, and it has different neural circuits, and basically whether or not you feel very alert or panicked or alert but calm or a little bit of anxiety, that's going to depend on the balance between this alertness system and the calmness system. If you're having a full-blown panic attack, then the alertness system is, it's as if the seesaw is tilted all that way. If you have, if you're deeply asleep, well, then the calmness system is really tilted down. You could say that's a portion of the seesaw. In this seesaw model that I'm putting forward, the seesaw has to include what I would call a hinge, a location in the middle in which you can voluntarily adjust the seesaw to either be more tilted toward alert or more tilted toward asleep. And for many people, they find that their overall level of autonomic arousal is either inappropriate or inadequate for the demands of their life. Inappropriate meaning their heart is racing, they feel more jittery, more as if movement would be the default and worry would be the default and anticipation is the default than is appropriate for their circumstances. Waking up in the morning and feeling stressed, for instance, immediately without any immediate cause or maybe stress about real life events. For other people, they feel more exhausted than they would like. They're having a hard time leaning into the pressures of daily life. Both of those, even though they have sort of polarized phenotypes, they look very different. In one case, over energized, and in one case, under energized. Both originate within the autonomic nervous system. And we can reliably say from work done in animals and humans that that is not the consequence of the alertness system or the calmness system being disrupted, but rather that hinge in the middle is dysregulated. And we now know what that hinge is. And this is based on work done by colleagues of mine at Stanford, in particular a guy named David Spiegel, who's our associate chair of psychiatry. He's done a lot of work, and it's actually his father did a lot of work in the application of clinical hypnosis, not stage hypnosis, but clinical hypnosis for the treatment of various things. But his work and some work in our laboratory now has shown that there's an area of the brain that you are familiar with, the prefrontal cortex, and in particular, the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, if you really want to get down in the weeds about it, that has direct communication with two brain areas that are absolutely critical for this issue of whether or not you feel right for your circumstances, whether or not you translate that into a curiosity and exploration, or whether or not you translate it into this thing that we call anxiety. And those two areas are called the anterior cingulate cortex. Again, I apologize for all the names, but the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula. And I think if I were to make a prediction about what the buzzword is going to be in popular neuroscience in the next 5 years, it's not the amygdala, it's not the prefrontal cortex, it's the insula. The insula has a couple of different regions, but one of its primary regions, the front end, the anterior insula, is responsible for interpreting all those bodily signals. It essentially is a funnel for all those signals about breath rate, heart rate, conditions of the gut, whether or not your body feels ready to move or exhausted, et cetera. And that all funnels into the insula. And then also coming into the insula is information from classical areas like the amygdala, which are involved in threat detection and fear, and also emotion and memory. So the insula is really this incredible hub of information about somatic signals, about bodily signals. And then the prefrontal cortex, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in particular, is in communication with the insula. If we were to really dial back and say, what is the prefrontal cortex in the position to do? It's a flexible rule-setting structure. How do we know that? I'm sure you are probably more familiar than I am with the classic Stroop task. You give somebody a bunch of cards with different words on them, and those words are written in different colors, and you tell the person okay, just read the words to me. Ignore the color that they're written in, just read them. And so they're saying they're cat, dog, shelf, book, professor, student, etc. Then you quickly change the rules and you say, you know what, just tell me the color that the words are written in, but ignore what the words say. And people will do that, but there's a portion of time in which they slow down a bit. It's actually hard because you've done a rule switch. Now, what we know is that the insula and the prefrontal cortex are both intimately involved in this conversation that establishes which rules are appropriate for a given situation. So, for instance, if somebody were to say something that quote unquote triggers me, okay, I'll use myself as the example, right? Maybe someone will tweet something and I'll think, and I immediately want to respond in a way that I know I can kind of flip them on their back immediately. But then I think, maybe I want to refrain from that for any number of different rules or reasons, right? Well, then I'm starting to apply different rules. I'm starting to think about the context that's outside of the autonomic response. Because in a strict, very animalistic way, in other words, in the absence of an insula and a prefrontal cortex conversation, really the only thing an animal or human needs to do is just respond to their arousal in, it's either, you can either retreat, you can stay put, or you can fight. The prefrontal cortex, in particular, the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is in an incredibly unique position to not only establish different rules depending on context. And the way it does that is by accessing memory. So the hippocampus has access to prefrontal cortex and vice versa. It's almost always a reciprocal conversation. So it can pull memory thinking, the last time I responded like that didn't get me the result I wanted. Or the last time I responded in this other way, I got the result I wanted. Again, regardless of situation. The other thing that the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is exquisitely positioned to do, and this is beautiful work of a colleague of mine by the name of Nolan Williams, also in psychiatry, is because of its connections to some structures that then feed into the vagus nerve, it actually can slow the heart rate down. So in other words, let's say someone says something and your immediate impulse is to fight or to respond in a kind of knee-jerk way. If you halt, right, I guess what the meditators and the mindfulness folks was called the gap, or if you can access some memory and think, and you might be thinking, actually there's a much better way to place the dart if I just kind of lean back a little bit. Or it could be, silence might be the best response, right? Or it could be that you're going to carefully access some data from your hippocampus to respond in a way that is most effective. For instance, here I'm talking about confrontation, but it could be any situation. The left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex does two things. As it acquires a new rule set or starts to access information about a new or possible rule set, it also sends a parallel signal to slow the heart down through the vagus nerve. And that is, I think, one of the more important and fascinating discoveries in the last 5 years. Those aren't data from my laboratory. I wish they were. But it's very clear that when we start accessing alternate rule sets, there's a signal that quiets the body in some way. I'll confess I've been in therapy enough to know that occasionally, one feels as if you're accessing some piece of info as the patient side. I can only report from the patient side, accessing some what feels like important piece of information. You're pulling on a thread of some sort, but then the therapist will say something and it literally gives you that alternate view. And this notion of looking at things through a different perspective, we often think about that as a switch in our cognitive frame, in our thinking, but also, we now know there's this parallel signal that's sent to the body in which, in order to access these alternate rule sets, new ways of looking at things, there's a calming signal literally sent to the body as well. And I find this conversation fascinating because normally we just think about anxiety and exploration and rule setting and rule responses or responses to rules, et cetera, as a kind of the body sends signals and the brain does all this, what neuroscientists have always talked about as top-down processing. Right, just sort of suppress the hypothalamus. And there's a very interesting phenomenon that takes place in people that have chronic anxiety or for people who essentially stop accessing alternate rules and responses to these signals. And this is, I think, what is showing up in chronic anxiety, certainly in certain forms of depression, and when people enter states of rage and dysregulation, is that normally we know based on neuroimaging that the prefrontal cortex is essentially leading the response of this anterior cingulate cortex and the insula. So information is coming up from the body into the insula, and then being fed to the prefrontal cortex. But then the prefrontal cortex is actually in a position to lead responses, and it essentially is acting like the coach of a team. And the team is all these structures like the ACC and the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula, the heart rate, and so forth. What happens in individuals who have chronic anxiety or damage to the prefrontal cortex or dysregulation of these circuitries is that order actually reverses. The insula and ACC start leading and directing the response of the prefrontal cortex. We see this in dysregulated arguments and dysregulated combat, where people is essentially losing themselves, and they default to what appears to be very primitive rule set. And it may or may not be the appropriate one. Yep. But you and I, of course, have the good fortune of knowing a number of people who've worked in special operations and things like that. And you talk to any of those individuals, and they know from experience and from training that their ability to access multiple rule sets and options in the moments of extreme autonomic arousal is actually where their power lies, right? It's or a combat fighter, or let's just take, or in debate. In a really good debate, you can't allow the autonomic response to overtake you, or you lose access to an enormous database that resides in one's hippocampus, and one then defaults to the bodily state, right? And this is what we see when we see people become dysregulated in rage, et cetera. So if we were to zoom out and then ask, where is the line between exploration and anxiety? I think that we can check off a few boxes for sure. First of all, that autonomic arousal, this tendency to be more alert or more in action than in non-action, is a very healthy response. I mean, the moment adrenaline is released from the adrenals, and as you know, there's a parallel signal in the brain. You get adrenaline released from the adrenals if you get in a cold shower, or somebody says something triggering, or you are afraid of heights or something. But the brain has its own kind of adrenaline system, which is this structure in the back of the brain called locus ceruleus. And it basically it essentially sprinklers the entire brain with noradrenaline and adrenaline. It's a very interesting system. It lacks specificity. It basically wakes up the whole brain. If I were to put a little, if I were to label the connections of the locus ceruleus, it's basically connected to everything. It just kind of sprinkles a caffeine-like substance on the entire brain, wakes you up. The adrenals in the body wake up the body. So two parallel systems wake us up. If somebody has a lesion in their dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or if you transiently inactivate it with a technology, a non-invasive technology like transcranial magnetic stimulation, they can now just put a magnet on outside the skull and quiet that area of the brain transiently. In animals or humans, what you find is that person or human becomes incredibly accurate at any motor task. So for instance, if I were to give you a shooter game where you're supposed to shoot targets, and you're shooting targets, you'll have some hits and some misses, like anybody. If I inactivate your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, your accuracy goes through the roof. It's near 100%. But the one thing you can't do is decide whether or not you're shooting an enemy or a friend. So you can no longer establish rules. You just become very good at execution of the motor behavior. And so we see this theme over and over again, where as a purely sensory motor response machine, the prefrontal cortex isn't even necessary. In fact, if you get rid of it entirely, people become like machines. If I click over here, somebody has no prefrontal cortex, basically everything becomes a stimulus. The prefrontal cortex is a rule-changing, alternate self-accessing machine that can also calm the body. And one reason to suppress the somatic response, the bodily response, is that tends to be a unitary interpretation, meaning at this moment I feel alert but calm, so I feel good. But I'm guessing there's a lot of signals coming from the body, and in fact there are to my brain, but I tend to just say, I feel pretty good. In fact, I'm very delighted to be here, so I feel good. Or if I'm very tired, I feel tired. Those tend to be very kind of binned responses, and they're fairly generic. Whereas your description of what the prefrontal cortex does, which is an accurate one, I should say, of imagining different selves and different outcomes, almost requires that we suppress how we feel in our body in the moment. I guess we can look to some of our podcasting colleagues like the Jocko Willinks or the David Goggins, who are either forcing themselves or are somehow up at 4:30 in the morning and pushing through that, what I call limbic friction. The limbic system is saying, I'm tired or I'm anxious, and going against that. So there's literally there's a required suppression of the bodily response in order to imagine how we would feel when we complete this. It's as if it's running plays. I'm using a sports analogy. It's running plays and thinking about potential outcomes. How many moves can you anticipate if this, then that? It's sort of if this, then that type of thinking. And if you think about its connectivity, it's in a beautiful position based on its access to priors through the hippocampus, so memory. It can take into account current state, bodily state. It can access information, for instance, about, do I have the energy? Do I have the resources to undergo a particular pattern of response? And that's through the insula and the ACC. And then the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, in this way of also being able to control the body, of being able to calm the body, this is a very unique pathway, because typically we think of the heart rate as going up if we're excited or scared, and heart rate going down if we're calm. But really the default of the neural inputs to the heart and to the breathing systems, et cetera, are to be very activated. And then the brain provides a suppressive or kind of a braking on that. It's a default on system. And the vagus nerve, which of course is a massive nerve pathway. Again, it makes it sound like one little nerve, but it's this huge superhighway of connections between brain and body, is classified in medical school as a parasympathetic pathway, meaning of the calming system, kind of generically speaking. And indeed it is. And so the prefrontal cortex, we can think of as, remember in the seesaw analogy, the hinge. The prefrontal cortex is more or less like the screwdriver that tightens that hinge, essentially make sure that the seesaw stays at a level, at a tilt that's appropriate for whatever it is that you happen to be doing. What we know is that the prefrontal cortex and its associated networks contain a near infinite, if not infinite, set of possibilities, right? I mean, of course, it's bottlenecked by experience, and it's bottlenecked by one's imagination. But the number of different possible selves that one could imagine is near infinite if one were to spend time on it. Whereas the number of different bodily states that one can have are actually very finite. And if you think about the autonomic nervous system, and in my laboratory, we've studied this typically in the context of fear and confrontation, that the simplest way to put this in a kind of pop neuroscience way would be to say, we can either be back on our heels, meaning retreating, or we can be flat-footed, sort of calm in our stance, or we can be forward center of mass. We can be in sort of pursuit and or competition. There really aren't other motor responses for an animal, including humans, right? You can either stay put, back up, or go forward. So these three major categories, I think, encompass most, if not all, of the possible responses, as you said, and probably form the base set for all emotions. I mean, my laboratory studied this mainly in the context of fear and confrontation. And one of the reasons we started to explore this was the following. We've all heard of fight or flight, or rest and digest, right? Those correspond to the alertness system and the calmness system of the autonomic nervous system in their kind of extreme forms. But what we observed in animals, and then now in human studies, we published about a year ago, is that when people are confronted with an anxiety-provoking scenario, in our case, we do this with virtual reality because we need to do it in the laboratory, we find their pain point, essentially. And by pain point, I don't mean extreme fear. I mean the thing that can raise their autonomic arousal, that has them in a mode of considering different options and trying to figure out what is strategic and what they're capable of in that moment. Could be heights, could be confrontation with a predator, animal. It varies by person, but everyone has their pain point. Even Navy SEALs that we brought to the laboratory, or other people from the special operations community, each and everyone has their pain point. What they do in response to that pain point is really what's interesting. And what we found was that the pause or freeze response certainly was associated with autonomic arousal, with stress and anxiety. We measure this in the brain and body. But it was the lowest anxiety response. People always think of panic, just being paralyzed in panic. That's actually the lowest anxiety response. Retreat was the next level up in terms of levels of heart rate change and levels of change within the insula. And then we found that there were a subset of individuals and animals in the parallel animal work that would confront a fear, not necessarily reflexively, but after some consideration, they would lean into the challenge, essentially confront the thing that was making them feel anxious. And it turned out that that response, surprisingly, was associated with the highest levels of autonomic arousal. Heart rate activation and a change in what it's called the so-called gamma wave activity in the insula. We had electrodes in the insula, and what we found was that people who were willing to lean into that challenge, the insula took on essentially a change in its activity patterns, this gamma pattern. The heart rate increased, breathing increased, sweating increased. So these are all the marks of an anxiety attack. But here, if you were to just look at the behavior of the person or the animal, what you'd find is that they were marching forward toward their fear. We thought, okay, wow, well, there are animals. These mice will tail flick in response to a threat, which is essentially saying, come on, let's go, let's fight. Whereas other animals would retreat. And that tail flicking paralleled with in the human studies with people being confronted with it. For someone who's scared of heights, to go through a virtual reality scenario of being up on a high beam between buildings might not sound like a big deal to the average video gamer or to you and me, but is an absolutely terrifying experience for those people. But a subset of them will just march out onto that platform, or will even explore jumping off the platform with the understanding that it's virtual and get very scared, but they will do it. And they also show these changes in insula activity and changes in heart rate and breathing. What was interesting to us was the mouse data told us that if you stimulate the brain area that was associated with all of this, it's an area of the midline thalamus. I don't want to get down into details of structures too much, but it was a very mysterious area, not been explored much before. Had this incredible name of nucleus reunions. Why, I don't know. The neuroanatomists name these things peculiar ways, as you know. But if we were to stimulate that brain area in mice, we could convert a terrified, non-confrontational mouse into a mouse that was willing to confront its fears in a healthy and adaptive way. It wasn't being foolishly running into the jaws of a predator. It was being very strategic in its confrontation. The interesting thing was if we introduced no fear stimulus, no heights, no predator, no nothing, and we just tickle this brain area, what we found is that animals and humans love that feeling. In fact, they will work for that feeling more than they will work for other stimulation. It's not about having, it's about wanting. It's not about pleasure as much as it is about craving and motivation and drive. The prefrontal cortex is actually part of the dopamine reward system. People often overlook this, and then we just think about nucleus accumbens and ventral tegmental area. But the prefrontal cortex, because as you pointed out before, it is generating possible outcomes, different rules, different selves are being projected into the future. The key thing with dopamine, I think, that encapsulates the most of it is this notion of reward prediction error, which is very simple. If you are excited and anticipating something, you are generating some internal sense of the probability of it happening. We're going to the ice cream store, kids. Let's go. We're going to have ice cream. We have ice cream. It's closed. The disappointment that they experience actually brings them far lower than they would feel, much more sad than they would feel than had you not told them you were going to get ice cream, which speaks exactly to what you were saying, that it's an anticipation signal. So dopamine's going up, 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 we're going to get ice cream, and then no. So it drops below baseline. If you anticipate that it's going to be open, and again, this could translate to any scenario, and it's open, there's a dopaminergic signal upon receiving the reward, but it then drops a little bit. This is the basis of addiction, actually. Drops a little bit below baseline transiently. So we always think of the ice cream is the reward. Well, actually, the reward was right before you had that first lick of ice cream because you know you're going to get it. This is also true of sexual behavior. It's true of people who sell a company or they're anticipating something exciting, or of a wedding. It also sort of partially explains this notion of postpartum depression, where people are so excited about something, the delivery of a child or something on the arrival, and then for some reason they feel let down. It's because the anticipation was that great. The memory for events and states of mind and emotions that preceded a successful collection of reward or arrival at reward is set into a huge number of motor commands, some of which are subconscious. And the ultimate dopamine signal, actually, I experienced this the other day. I can give an example. My girlfriend and I decided to go to the beach. We were going to go do this little ritual that we've been talking about doing for a while. And I had on a piece of paper what we had written out we were going to do. And I had it in my back pocket. And we got to the ocean and the sun was setting. It was sort of perfect timing for this. And the piece of paper was gone. And I thought, oh my goodness, how did I screw this up? Like, of all the things, I'm 47 years old. This is not like I should be able to do this. I went back to the car, long walk, looking everywhere. It was not a windy day, but I thought, gosh, where's this piece of paper? Looking around, didn't find it. Went all the way back to the car, was in the car, came all the way back, and I was walking toward her. I saw her, and I thought, okay, this is really embarrassing. I'm gonna just have to wing it or remember. We didn't have our phones intentionally either, so we couldn't look it up. And then I saw the piece of paper on the beach. And it was partially buried in the sand. I picked it up and I was elated. What happened there was my dopamine had dropped way below baseline because I was disappointed that I'd lost it, disappointed in myself, et cetera. That self image that I had in that moment of, I'm the responsible partner who can take care of a simple thing, right? For this nice little ritual that we'd been talking about doing for a while. I failed, right? My thought train went to the point of, I didn't think, I'm a total failure because I lost this piece of paper. I thought to myself, well, if it were a priority, I would have ensured I wouldn't have lost it. She'll interpret it as not being a priority. Like, where are my priorities? Am I overspent? What's going on? You start to sift into the full set of questions. And then, of course, finding the paper resurrects the sense of self.
To learn more about reframing with alternate rule sets, take a look at a book called Mind Lines, or a brief review I did on it with the Mind Lines for Kamala video, so that you can learn more tools and rules for improving your own mental well-being here at reprogrammingmind.com. Bye for now.